This book is largely concerned with hobbits, and from its pages a reader may discover much of their character and a little of their history. Further information will also be found in the selection from the Red Book of Westmarch that has already been published under the title of The Hobbit. That story was derived from the earlier chapters of the Red Book, composed by Bilbo himself, the first hobbit to become famous in the world at large, and called by him There and Back Again, since they told of his journey into the East and his return, an adventure which later involved all the hobbits in the great events of that age that are here related. Many, however, may wish to know more about this remarkable people from the outset, while some may not possess the earlier book. For such readers, a few notes on the more important points are here collected from Hobbit lore, and the first adventure is briefly recalled. Hobbits are an unobtrusive but very ancient people, more numerous formerly than they are today, for they love peace and quiet and good-tilled earth. A well-ordered and well-farmed countryside was their favorite haunt. They do not and did not understand or like machines more complicated than a forge bellows, a water mill, or a hand loom, though they were skillful with tools. Even in ancient days, they were, as a rule, shy of the big folk, as they call us, and now they avoid us with dismay and are becoming hard to find. They are quick of hearing and sharp-eyed, and though they are inclined to be fat and do not hurry unnecessarily, they are nonetheless nimble and deft in their movements. They possessed from the first the art of disappearing swiftly and silently when large folk whom they do not wish to meet come blundering by, and this art they have developed until to men it may seem magical. But hobbits have never, in fact, studied magic of any kind, and their elusiveness is due solely to a professional skill that heredity and practice, and a close friendship with the earth have rendered inimitable by bigger and clumsier races. For they are a little people, smaller than dwarves, less stout and stocky, that is, even when they are not actually much shorter. Their height is variable, ranging between 2 and 4 feet of our measure. They seldom now reach 3 feet, but they have dwindled, they say. In ancient days they were taller. According to the Red Book, Bandobris Took, Bullroarer, son of Isengrim II, was 4'5" and able to ride a horse. He was surpassed in all Hobbit records only by 2 famous characters of old, but that curious matter is dealt with in this book. As for the hobbits of the Shire with whom these tales are concerned, in the days of their peace and prosperity they were a merry folk. They dressed in bright colors, being notably fond of yellow and green, but they seldom wore shoes, since their feet had tough, leathery soles and were clad in a thick, curling hair, much like the hair of their heads, which was commonly brown. Thus, the only craft little practiced among them was shoemaking. But they had long and skillful fingers, and they could make many other useful and comely things. Their faces were, as a rule, good-natured rather than beautiful, broad, bright-eyed, red-cheeked, with mouths apt to laughter, and to eating and drinking. And laugh they did, and eat and drink, often and heartily, being fond of simple jests at all times, and of 6 meals a day, when they could get them. They were hospitable and delighted in parties and in presents, which they gave away freely and eagerly accepted. It is at this point I check on my stream and see if I can hear my own voice. Yep, okay. Good. It is plain indeed that in spite of later estrangement, hobbits are relatives of ours, far nearer to us than elves, and even than dwarves. Of old they spoke the languages of men, after their own fashion, and liked and disliked much the same things as men did. But what exactly our relationship is can no longer be discovered. The beginning of hobbits lies far back in the elder days, and are now lost and forgotten. Only the elves still preserve any records of that vanished time, and their traditions are concerned almost entirely with their own history, in which men appear seldom, and hobbits are not mentioned at all. Yet it is clear that hobbits had in fact lived quietly in Middle-earth for many long years before other folk became even aware of them. Gotcha. Thank you, Sar. And at the world being, after all, full of strange creatures beyond count, these little people seemed of very little importance. But in the days of Bilbo and of Frodo, his heir, they suddenly became, by no wish of their own, both important and renowned, and troubled the counsels of the wise and the great. How's my sound sounding? Still kind of loud, huh? That could just be my voice. Those days, the third age of Middle-earth, are now long past, and the shape of all lands has been changed. But the regions in which hobbits then lived were doubtless the same as those in which they still linger, the northwest of the old world, east of the sea. Of their original home, the hobbits in Bilbo's time preserved no knowledge. A love of learning, other than genealogical lore, was far from general among them, but there remained still a few of the older families who studied their own books, and even gathered reports of old times and distant lands from elves, dwarves, and men. Their own records began only after the settlement of the Shire, and their most ancient legends hardly looked further back than their wandering days. It is clear, nonetheless, from these legends, and from the evidence of their peculiar works and customs, that, like many other folk, hobbits had, in the distant past, moved westward. Their earliest tales seem to glimpse a time when they dwelt in the upper vales of Anduin, between the eaves of Greenwood the Great and the Misty Mountains. Why they later undertook the hard and perilous crossing of the mountains into Eriador is no longer certain. Their own accounts speak of the multiplying of men in the land, and of a shadow that fell on the forest, so that it became darkened, and its new name was Mirkwood. Before the crossing of the mountains, the hobbits had already become divided into three somewhat different breeds: Harfoots, Stewars, and Followhides. The Harfoots were browner of skin, smaller and shorter, and they were beardless and bootless. Their hands and feet were neat and nimble, and they preferred highlands and hillsides. The Stewars were broader, heavier in build. Their feet and hands were larger, and they preferred flatlands and riversides. The Followhides were fairer of skin and also of hair, and they were taller and slimmer than the others. They were lovers of trees and woodlands. The Harfoots had much to do with dwarves in the ancient times, and long lived in the foothills of the mountains. They moved westward early and roamed over Eriador as far as Weathertop, while the others were still in Wilderland. They were the most normal and representative variety of hobbit, and far the most numerous. They were the most inclined to settle in one place, and longest preserved their ancestral habit of living in tunnels and holes. The Stewars lingered long by the banks of the great river Anduin, and were less shy of men. They came west after the Harfoots and followed the course of the Loudwater southwards, and there many of them long dwelt between Tharbad and the borders of Dunland before they moved north again. The Fallowhides, the least numerous, were a northerly branch. They were more friendly with elves than the other hobbits were, and had more skill in language and song than in handicrafts, and of old they preferred hunting to tilling. They crossed the mountains north of Rivendell, and came down the river Horwell. In Eriador they soon mingled with the other kinds that had preceded them, but being somewhat bolder and more adventurous, they were often found as leaders or chieftains among clans of Harfoots or Stoors. Even in Bilbo's time, the strong Fallowheadish strain could be still noted among the greater families, such as the Tooks and the Masters of Buckland. In the westlands of Eriador, between the Misty Mountains and the Mountains of Lune, the hobbits found both men and elves. Indeed, a remnant still dwelt there of the Dunedain, the kings of men that came over the sea out of Westerness. He's getting me with the words. But they were dwindling fast, and the lands of their north kingdom were falling far and wide into waste. There was no room to spare for incomers, and ere long the hobbits began to settle in ordered communities. Most of their earlier settlements had long disappeared and been forgotten in Bilbo's time, but one of the first to become important still endured, though reduced in size. This was at Bree, and in the Chetwood that lay around, some 40 miles east of the Shire. It was in these early days, doubtless, that the hobbits learned their letters and began to write after the manner of the Dunedain, who had in their turn long before learned the art from the elves. And in those days also they forgot whatever languages they had used before, and spoke ever after the common speech, the Westron, as it was named, that was current throughout all the lands of the kings from Arnor to Gondor, and about all the coasts of the sea from Belfalis to Lune. Yet they kept a few words of their own, as well as their own names of months and days, and a great store of personal names out of the past. About this time, legend among the hobbits first becomes history with a reckoning of years. For it was in the 1601st year of the Third Age that the Fallowhide brothers, Marcho and Blanco, set out from Bree, and having obtained permission from the High King at Fornost, they crossed the Brown River Barandwin with a great following of hobbits. They passed over the bridge of stone boughs that had been built in the days of the power of the North Kingdom, and they took all the lands beyond to dwell in, between the river and the far downs. All that was demanded of them was that they should keep the great bridge in repair, and all other bridges and roads, speed the king's messengers, and acknowledge his lordship. Thus began the Shire reckoning, for the year of the crossing of the Brandywine, as the hobbits turned the name, became year 1 of the Shire, and all later dates were reckoned from it. I don't know if I'm going to get to all of the little footnotes that are in here. We'll read this one because I stopped. There's a footnote that says, "Thus the years of the Third Age and the reckoning of the elves and the Dunedain may be found by adding 1600 to the dates of Shire reckoning." Convenient. At once the western hobbits fell in love with their new land, and they remained there and soon passed once more out of the history of men and elves. While there was still a king, they were in name his subjects, but they were in fact ruled by their own chieftains, and meddled not at all with the events in the world outside. To the last battle at Fornost with the Witch Lord of Angmar, they sent some bowmen to the aid of the king, or so they maintained, though no tales of men record it. But in that war the North Kingdom ended, and then the hobbits took the land for their own, and they chose from their own chiefs a thane to hold the authority of the king that was gone. There for 1,000 years they were little troubled by wars, and they prospered and multiplied after the Dark Plague, Shire reckoning 37. until the disaster of the long winter and the famine that followed it. Many thousand then perished, but the days of death, 1158 to 60, were at the time of this tale long past, and the hobbits had again become accustomed to plenty. The land was rich and kindly, and though it had long been deserted when they entered it, it had before been well tilled, and there the king had once had many farms, cornlands, vineyards, and woods. 40 leagues it stretched from the Fox Downs to the Brandywine Bridge, and 50 from the western moors to the marshes in the south. The hobbits named it the Shire, as the region of the authority of their thane, and a district of well-ordered business, and there in that pleasant corner of the world they plied their well-ordered business of living, and they heeded less and less the world outside where dark things moved, until they came to think that peace and plenty were the rule in Middle-earth, and the right of all sensible folk. They forgot or ignored what little they had ever known of the guardians, and of the labors of those that made possible the long peace of the Shire. They were, in fact, sheltered, but they had ceased to remember it. At no time had hobbits of any kind been warlike, and they had never fought amongst themselves. In olden days they had, of course, been often obliged to fight to maintain themselves in a hard world, but in Bilbo's time that was very ancient history. The last battle before this story opens, and indeed the only one that had ever been fought within the borders of the Shire, was beyond living memory. The Battle of Green Fields, Shire Reckoning 1147, in which Bandobras routed an invasion of orcs. Even the weather had grown milder, and the wolves that had once come ravening out of the north in bitter white winters were now only a grandfather's tale. So, though there was still some store of weapons in the Shire, those were used mostly as trophies, hanging above hearths or on walls, or gathered into the museum at, it looks like Mitchell Delving, we'll say. I knew he was going to get me eventually. The Matham House, it was called. That one's much better, thank you. For anything that hobbits had no immediate use for, but were unwilling to throw away, they called a Matham. That's such a good word. Their dwellings were apt to become rather crowded with Mathams, and many of the presents that passed from hand to hand were of that sort. And nonetheless, ease and peace had left this people still curiously tough. They were, if it came to it, difficult to daunt or to kill, and they were, perhaps, so unwearyingly fond of good things, not less because they could, when put to it, do without them, and could survive through rough handling by grief, foe, or weather in a way that astonished those who did not know them well, and looked no further than their bellies and their well-fed faces. Though slow to quarrel, and for sport killing nothing that lived, they were Doty? At bay? I don't know any of these words. These look like English words, too. That's my fault. Sure, Doty at bay. And at need could handle arms. I need to... Doty, okay. You're going to have to look that one up for us. They shot well with the bow, for they were keen-eyed and sure at the mark, not only with bows and arrows. If any hobbit stooped for a stone, it was well to get quickly under cover, as all trespassing beasts knew very well. All hobbits had originally lived in holes in the ground, or so they believed, and in such dwellings they still felt most at home. But in the course of time they had been obliged to adopt other forms of abode. Actually, in the Shire in Bilbo's days it was, as a rule, only the richest and the poorest hobbits that maintained the old custom. The poorest went on living in burrows of the most primitive kind, mere holes indeed, with only one window or none. while the well-to-do still constructed more luxurious versions of the simple dwellings of old. But suitable sites for these large and ramifying tunnels, or smeals as they called them, were not everywhere to be found, and in the flats, the low-lying districts, the hobbits, as they multiplied, began to build above ground. Indeed, even in the hilly regions and the older villages, such as Hobbiton or Tookborough, or in the chief township of the Shire, Mitchell Delving on the White Downs, there were now many houses of wood, brick, or stone. These were specially favored by millers, smiths, ropers, and cartwrights, and others of that sort, for even when they had holes to live in, hobbits had long been accustomed to build sheds and workshops. The habit of building farmhouses and barns was said to have begun among the inhabitants of the marsh down by the Brandywine. The hobbits of that quarter, East Farthing, were rather large and heavy-legged, and they wore dwarf boots in muddy weather. But they were well known to be stewards in a large part of their blood, as indeed was shown by the down that many grew on their chins. No Harfoot or Fallowhide had any trace of a beard. Indeed, the folk of the marsh and of Buckland, east of the river, which they afterwards occupied, came for the most part later into the Shire, up from south away, and they still had many peculiar names and strange words not found elsewhere in the Shire. It is probable that the craft of building, as many other crafts besides, was derived from the Dunedain, but the hobbits may have learned it directly from the elves, the teachers of men in their youth. For the elves of the High Kindred had not yet forsaken Middle-earth, and they dwelt still, at that time, at the Grey Havens, away to the west, and in other places within reach of the Shire. 3 elf towers of immemorial age were still to be seen beyond the western marshes. They shone far off in the moonlight. The tallest was furthest away, standing alone upon a green hill. The hobbits of the West Farthing said that one could see the sea from above the top of that tower, but no hobbit had ever been known to climb it. Indeed, few hobbits had ever seen or sailed upon the sea, and fewer still had ever returned to report it. Most hobbits regarded even rivers and small boats with deep misgivings, and not many of them could swim. And as the days of the Shire lengthened, they spoke less and less with the elves, and grew afraid of them, and distrusted those that had dealings with them. And the sea became a word of fear among them, and a token of death, and they turned their faces away from the hills in the west. The craft of building may have come from elves or men, but the hobbits used it in their own fashion. They did not go in for towers. Their houses were usually long, low, and comfortable. The oldest kind were indeed no more than built imitations of smeals, thatched with dry grass or straw, or roofed with turves, and having walls somewhat bulged. That stage, however, belonged to the early days of the Shire, and hobbit building had long since been altered, improved by devices learned from the dwarves or discovered by themselves. A preference for round windows and even round doors was the chief remaining peculiarity of hobbit architecture. The houses and the holes of Shire hobbits were often large and inhabited by large families. Bilbo and Frodo Baggins were, as bachelors, very exceptional, and they were also, in many other ways, such as their friendship with elves. Sometimes, as in the case of the Tooks of Great Smeals, or the Brandybooks of Brandy Hill, many generations of relatives lived in comparative peace together in one ancestral and many-tunneled mansion. All hobbits were, in any case, clannish, and reckoned up their relationships with care. They drew long and elaborate family trees with innumerable branches. In dealing with hobbits, it is important to remember who is related to whom, and in what degree. It would be impossible in this book to set out a family tree that included even the more important members of the more important families at the time which these tales tell of, The genealogical trees at the end of the Red Book of Westmarch are a small book in themselves, and all but hobbits would find them exceedingly dull. Hobbits delighted in such things, if they were accurate. They liked to have books filled with things that they already knew, set out fair and square with no contradictions. Oh. We're actually reading the prologue right now, which I always think it's important to start off with concerning hobbits. We got a couple more pages in the prologue before we can start the main thing. Next up we have prologue part 2 concerning pipeweed. There is another thing about the hobbits of old that must be mentioned, an astonishing habit. They imbibed or inhaled through pipes of clay or wood the smoke of the burning leaves of an herb, which they called pipeweed or leaf, a variety probably of nicotiana. A great deal of mystery surrounds the origin of this peculiar custom, or art, as the hobbits preferred to call it. All that could be discovered about it in antiquity was put together by Meriadoc Brandybook, later Master of Buckland. And since he and the tobacco of the South Farthing play a part in the history that follows, his remarks in the introduction to his herb lore of the Shire may be quoted. This, he says, is the one art that we can certainly claim to be our own invention. When hobbits first began to smoke, it is not known. All the legends and family histories take it for granted. For ages, folk in the Shire smoked various herbs, some fouler, some sweeter. But all accounts agree that Tobold Hornblower of Longbottom, in the South Farthing, first grew the true pipeweed in his gardens in the days of Isengrim II, about the year 1070 of Shire reckoning. The best homegrown still comes from that district, especially the varieties now known as Longbottom Leaf, Old Toby, and Southern Star. How Old Toby came by the plant is not recorded, for to his dying day he would not tell. He knew much about herbs, but he was no traveler. It is said that in his youth he often went to Bree, though he certainly never went further from the Shire than that. It is thus quite possible that he learned of this plant in Bree, where now at any rate it grows well on the south slopes of the hill. The Bree hobbits claim to have been the first actual smokers of the pipeweed. They claim, of course, to have done everything before the people of the Shire, whom they refer to as colonists. But in this case, their claim is, I think, likely to be true. And certainly it was from Bree that the art of smoking the genuine weed spread in the recent centuries among dwarves and other such folk, rangers, wizards, or wanderers, as still passed to and fro from that ancient road meeting. The home and center of the art is thus to be found in the old inn of Bree, the Prancing Pony, that has been kept by the family of Butterbur from time beyond recall. All the same, observations that I have made on my many journeys south have convinced me that the weed itself is not native to our part of the world, but came northward from the lower Anduin, whither it was, I suspect, originally brought over the sea by the men of Westerness. It grows abundantly in Gondor, and there is richer and larger than in the north, where it is never found wild, and flourishes only in warm, sheltered places like Longbottom. The men of Gondor call it sweet gallinus, and esteem it only for the fragrance of its flowers. From that land it must have been carried up the Greenway during the long centuries between the coming of Elendil and our own days. But even the Dunedain of Gondor allow us this credit. Hobbits first put it into pipes. Not even the wizards first thought of that before we did. Although one wizard that I knew took up the art long ago and became as skillful in it as in all other things that he put his mind to. All right. About halfway through the prologue. Part 3 of the Ordering of the Shire. The Shire was divided into 4 quarters, the farthings already referred to, north, south, east, and west, and these again each into a number of folklands, which still bore the names of some of the old leading families, although by the time of this history these names were no longer found, only in their proper folklands. Nearly all Tooks still lived in the Tookland, but that was not true of many other families, such as the Bagginses or the Boffins. Outside the farthings were the East and the West Marches, the Buckland and the West March added to the Shire in Shire Reckoning 1462. The Shire at this time had hardly any government. Families for the most part managed their own affairs. Growing food and eating it occupied most of their time. In other manners they were, as a rule, generous and not greedy, but contented and moderate, so that estates, farms, workshops, and small trades tended to remain unchanged for generations. There remained, of course, the ancient tradition concerning the High King at Fornost, or Norbury, as they called it, away north of the Shire, but there had been no king for nearly 1,000 years, and even the ruins of King's Norbury were covered in grass. Yet the hobbits still said of wild folk and wicked things, such as trolls, that they had not heard of the king. For they attributed to the king of old all their essential laws, and usually they kept the laws of free will, because they were the rules, as they said, both ancient and just. It is true that the Took family had long been preeminent, for their office of Thane had passed to them from the old Bucks some centuries before, and the chief Took had borne that title ever since. The Thane was the master of the Shire Moot, and the captain of the Shire Muster, and the hobbitry in arms. But as muster and moot were only held in times of emergency, which no longer occurred, the thaneship had ceased to be more than a nominal dignity. The Took family was still, indeed, accorded a special respect, for it remained both numerous and exceedingly wealthy, and was liable to produce in every generation strong characters of peculiar habits and even adventurous temperament. The latter qualities, however, were now rather tolerated in the rich than generally approved. The custom endured, none the less, of referring to the head of the family as the Took, and of adding to his name, if required, a number, such as Isengrim II, for instance. The only real official in the Shire at this date was the Mayor for Mitchell Delving, or of the Shire, who was elected every 7 years at the free fair on the White Downs at the Lythe, that is, at midsummer. As mayor, almost his only duty was to preside at banquets given on the Shire holidays, which occurred at frequent intervals, but the offices of postmaster and first sheriff were attached to the mayoralty, so that he managed both the messenger service and the watch. These were the only Shire services, and the messengers were the most numerous and much the busier of the two. By no means all hobbits were lettered, but those who were wrote constantly to all of their friends, and a selection of their relatives, who lived further off than an afternoon's walk. The sheriffs was the name that the hobbits gave to their police, or the nearest equivalent that they possessed. They had, of course, no uniforms, such things being quite unknown, only a feather in their caps, and they were in practice rather haywards than policemen, more concerned with the strayings of beasts than of people. There were in the Shire only 12 of them, 3 in each farthing, for inside work. A rather larger body, varying at need, was employed to beat the bounds, and to see that outsiders of any kind, great or small, did not make themselves a nuisance. At the time when this story begins, the bounders, as they were called, had been greatly increased. There were many reports and complaints of strange persons and creatures prowling about the borders, or over them. The first sign that all was not quite as it should be, and always had been except in tales and legends of long ago. Few heeded the sign, and not even Bilbo yet had any notion of what it portended. 60 years had passed since he set out on his memorable journey, and he was old even for hobbits, who reached 100 as often as not, but much evidently still maintained of the considerable wealth that he had brought back. How much or how little he revealed to no one, not even to Frodo, his favorite nephew. And he still kept secret the ring that he had found. Speaking of, almost the last part of the prologue, we have of the finding of the ring. As is told in The Hobbit, there came one day to Bilbo's door the great wizard, Gandalf the Grey, and 13 dwarves with him, none other indeed than Thorin Oakenshield, descendant of kings, and his 12 companions in exile. With them he set out, to his own lasting astonishment, on a morning of April, and it being then the year 1341, Shire reckoning, on a quest of great treasure, the dwarf hordes of the kings under the mountain, beneath Erebor in Dale, far off in the east. The quest was successful, and the dragon that guarded the horde was destroyed. Yet, though before all was won, the battle of 5 armies was fought, and Thorin was slain, and many deeds of renown were done. The matter would scarcely have concerned latter history, or earned more than a note in the long annals of the Third Age, but for an accident by the way. The party was assailed by orcs in a high pass of the Misty Mountains as they went towards Winterland, and so it happened that Bilbo was lost for a while in the black orc mines deep under the mountains. And there, as he groped in vain in the dark, he put his hand on a ring, lying on the floor of a tunnel. He put it in his pocket. It seemed then like mere luck. Trying to find his way out, Bilbo went on down to the roots of the mountains until he could go no further. At the bottom of the tunnel lay a cold lake, far from the light, and on an island of rock in the water lived Gollum. He was a loathsome little creature. He paddled a small boat with his large flat feet, peering with pale, luminous eyes, and catching blind fish with long fingers, and eating them raw. He ate any living thing, even orc, if he could catch it and strangle it without a struggle. He possessed a secret treasure that had come to him long ages ago, when he lived still in the light, a ring of gold that made its wearer invisible. It was the one thing he loved, his precious, and he talked to it even when it was not with him, for he kept it hidden safe in a hole on his island, except when he was hunting or spying on the orcs of the mines. Maybe he would have attacked Bilbo at once if the ring had been on him when they met, but it was not, and the hobbit held in his hands an elvish knife, which served him as a sword. So to gain time, Gollum challenged Bilbo to the riddle game, saying that if he asked a riddle which Bilbo could not guess, then he would kill him and eat him. But if Bilbo defeated him, then he would do as Bilbo wished. He would lead him to a way out of the tunnel. Since he was lost in the dark without hope, and could neither go on nor back, Bilbo accepted the challenge, and they asked one another many riddles. In the end, Bilbo won the game, more by luck, as it seemed, than by wits. For he was stumped at last for a riddle to ask, and cried out, as his hand came upon the ring he had picked up and forgotten, "What have I got in my pocket?" This Gollum failed to answer, though he demanded 3 guesses. The authorities, it is true, differ whether this last question was a mere question, and not a riddle, according to the strict rules of the game. But all agree that, after accepting it and trying to guess the answer, Gollum was bound by his promise, and Bilbo pressed him to keep his word. For the thought came to him that this slimy creature might prove false, even though such promises were held sacred, and of old all but the wickedest things feared to break them. But after ages alone in the dark, Gollum's heart was black, and treachery was in it. He slipped away, and returned to his island, of which Bilbo knew nothing, not far off, in the dark water. There, he thought, lay his ring. He was hungry now, and angry, and once his precious was with him, he would not fear any weapon at all. But the ring was not on the island. He had lost it. It was gone. His screech sent a shiver down Bilbo's back, though he did not yet understand what had happened. But Gollum had at last leaped to a guess, too late. "What has it got in its pocketses?" he cried. The light in his eyes was like a green flame as he sped back to murder the hobbit and recover his precious. Just in time, Bilbo saw his peril, and he fled blindly up the passage, away from the water, and once more he was saved by his luck, for as he ran he put his hand in his pocket, and the ring slipped quietly to his finger. It was that Gollum passed him without seeing him, and went on to guard the way out, lest the thief should escape. Warily Bilbo followed him, as he went along, cursing and talking to himself about his precious, from which talk at last even Bilbo guessed the truth. And hope came to him in the darkness. He himself had found the marvelous ring and a chance to escape from the orcs and from Gollum. At length they came to a halt before an unseen opening that led to the lower gates of the mines, on the eastward side of the mountains. There Gollum crouched at bay, smelling and listening, and Bilbo was tempted to slay him with his sword, but pity stayed him, and though he kept the ring, in which his only hope lay, he would not use it to help him kill the wretched creature at a disadvantage. In the end, gathering his courage, he leapt over Gollum in the dark, and fled away down the passage, pursued by his enemies' cries of hate and despair. "Thief! Thief! Baggins! We hate it forever!" Now it is a curious fact that this is not the story as Bilbo first told it to his companions. To them, his account was that Gollum had promised to give him a present if he won the game, but when Gollum went to fetch it from his island, he found the treasure was gone, a magic ring, which had been given to him long ago on his birthday. Bilbo guessed that this was the very ring that he had found, and as he had won the game, it was already his by right. But being in a tight place, he said nothing about it, and made Gollum show him the way out, as a reward instead of a present. This account Bilbo set down in his memoirs, and he seems never to have altered it himself, not even after the Council of Elrond. Evidently, it still appeared in the original Red Book, as it did in several of the copies and abstracts, but many copies contain the true account, as an alternative, derived no doubt from the notes by Frodo or Samwise, both of whom learned the truth, though they seem to have been unwilling to delete anything actually written by the old hobbit himself. Gandalf, however, disbelieved Bilbo's first story as soon as he heard it, and he continued to be very curious about the ring. Eventually he got the true tale out of Bilbo after much questioning, which for a while strained their friendship, but the wizard seemed to think the truth important. Though he did not say so to Bilbo, he also thought it important and disturbing to find that the good hobbit had not told the truth from the first, quite contrary to his habit. The idea of a present was not mere hobbit-like invention, all the same. It was suggested to Bilbo, as he confessed, by Gollum's talk that he overheard, for Gollum did, in fact, call the ring his birthday present many times. That also Gandalf thought strange and suspicious, but he did not discover the truth in this point for many more years, as will be seen in this book. Of Bilbo's later adventures, little more need be said here. With the help of the ring, he escaped from the orc guards at the gate and rejoined his companions. He used the ring many times on his quest, chiefly for the help of his friends, but he kept it secret from them as long as he could. After his return to his home, he never spoke of it again to anyone save Gandalf and Frodo, and no one else in the Shire knew of its existence, or so he believed. Only to Frodo did he show the account of his journey that he was writing. His sword, Sting, Bilbo hung over his fireplace, and from his coat of marvelous mail, the gift of the dwarves from the Dragon Hoard, he lent to a museum, to the Mitchell-Delving Matham House, in fact. but he kept in a drawer at Bag End the old cloak and hood that he had worn on his travels, and the ring, secured by a fine chain, remained in his pocket. He returned to his home at Bag End on June the 22nd, in his 52nd year, Shire reckoning 1342, and said nothing very notable occurred in the Shire until Mr. Baggins began the preparations of the celebration of his 111th birthday, Shire reckoning 1401. At this point, history begins. Except we have one more note on the Shire records. Tolkien! We have one more section. Note on the Shire records. At the end of the Third Age, the part played by the hobbits in the great events that led to the inclusion of the Shire in the reunited kingdom, I don't even remember that part, reunited kingdom, awakened among them a more widespread interest in their own history, and many of their traditions, up to that time still mainly oral, were collected and written down. The greater families were also concerned with the events in the kingdom at large, and many of their members studied its ancient histories and legends. By the end of the 1st century of the Fourth Age, there were already to be found in the Shire several libraries that contained many historical books and records. The largest of these collections were probably at Undertowers, at Great Smeals, and at Brandy Hall. This account of the end of the Third Age is drawn mainly from the Red Book of Westmarch, that most important source for the history of the War of the Ring, was so called because it was long preserved at Undertowers, the home of the Fairbairns, Wardens of the Westmarch. It was in origin Bilbo's private diary, which he took with him to Rivendell. Frodo brought it back to the Shire, together with many loose leaves of notes, and during Shire reckoning 1420-1, he nearly filled its pages with his account of the war, but annexed to it, and preserved with it, probably in a single red case, were the 3 large volumes, bound in red leather, that Bilbo gave to him as a parting gift. To these 4 volumes, there was added in Westmarch a 5th containing commentaries, genealogies, and various other matter concerning the Hobbit members of the Fellowship. The original Red Book has not been preserved, but many copies were made, especially of the 1st volume, for the use of the descendants of the children of Master Samwise. The most important copy, however, has a different history. It was kept at Great Smeals, and it was written in Gondor, probably at the request of the great-grandson of Peregrine, completed in Shire reckoning 1592. Its southern scribe appended this note: Findegil, King's writer, finished this work in IV 172. It is an exact copy in all details of the Thane's book in Minas Tirith. That book was a copy, made at the request of King Elisar, of the Red Book of the Perioneth, and was brought to him by the Thane Peregrine when he returned to Gondor in IV 64. The Thane's book was thus the first copy made of the Red Book, and contained much that was later omitted or lost. In Minas Tirith it received much annotation and many corrections, especially of names, words, and quotations in the Elvish languages, and there was added to it an abbreviated version of those parts of the tale of Aragorn and Arwen which lie outside the account of the war. The full tale is stated to have been written by Barahir, grandson of the steward Faramir, some time after the passing of the king. But the chief importance of Findegil's copy is that it alone contains the whole of Bilbo's translations from the Elvish. These 3 volumes were found to be a work of great skill and learning, in which between 1403 and 1418 he had used all the sources available to him in Rivendell, both living and written. but since they were little used by Frodo, being almost entirely concerned with the elder days, no more is said of them here. Since Meriadoc and Peregrine became the heads of their great families, and at the same time kept up their connections with Rohan and Gondor, the libraries at Bucklebury and Tuckborough contained much that did not appear in the Red Book. In Brandy Hall, there were many works dealing with Eriador and the history of Rohan. Some of these were composed or begun by Meriadoc himself, though in the Shire he was chiefly remembered for his herb lore of the Shire, and for his reckoning of years, in which he discussed the relation of the calendars of the Shire and Bree to those of Rivendell, Gondor, and Rohan. He also wrote a short treatise on old words and names in the Shire, showing special interest in discovering the kinship with the language of the Rohirrim of such Shire words as Matham and old elements and place names. At Great Smeals, the books were less interest to Shire folk, though more important for larger history. None of them was written by Peregrine, but he and his successors collected many manuscripts written by scribes of Gondor, mainly copies or summaries of histories or legends relating to Elendil and his heirs. Only here in the Shire were to be found extensive materials for the history of Númenor and the arising of Sauron. It was probably at Great Smeals that the Tale of Years was put together, with the assistance of material collected by Meriadoc. Though the dates given are often conjectural, especially for the Second Age, they deserve attention. It is probable that Meriadoc obtained assistance and information from Rivendell, which he visited more than once. There, though Elrond had departed, his sons long remained, together with some of the high elven folk. It is said that Celeborn went to dwell there after the departure of Galadriel, but there is no record of the day when at last he sought the Grey Havens, and with him went the last living memory of the elder days in Middle-earth. Whew. While I was reading that, I was thinking I should probably explain what's going on here. I like to start in situ, I think is what it's called, in the middle of the action, which is probably not generally considered to be a prologue. But this is giving some important backstory, because there are people, and this is before the movies existed, but we all have the movies now, so we shall be pretty well fine. There was one thing I was going to actually comment on this. I should probably add some commentary, but right, it is a good warm-up. I should probably add some commentary to make it a little more transformative, but I also don't want to take away from the lovely story too much. It's going to be a nice balance that's not really very balanced. What was that I was thinking on? I need to get a little more water here too, so I'm going to have a minute or two break anyway. I know, right? They gave us a little big spoilers for The Hobbit, by the way. Oops. Oftentimes there is always one spoiler that comes when you start a book, and that is in order for the book to have quote-unquote been written, if it's going to be told in this sort of story style. I guess the world didn't end up blowing up. Right? Don't worry. Huh. I cannot remember what it was. Well, any questions you have at this point will likely be answered at some point in the story. So I wouldn't worry too much about that. Tolkien is writing this from the perspective of a translator. When he's referencing the red books, he is referencing the imaginary existence of the books as material that he is translating for all of us into English. He is not a character inside the story, but he kind of is outside the story. It's very interesting. Yeah, I'm going to get a little more water, and I'll be right back. Should I play music while I do this? I don't know, I think I will. Here we go. Okay, I'm back. Oh, what a horrible noise. I see what you mean. I'm gonna turn myself down a little more. A mic aux test. What happens if I do this? Does this sound better? I was just messing around with the little sound knob, which is supposed to be turning my gain down or something. But doesn't seem to. It is breaking up into the red quite hard, and I think when I was reading I was trying to like speak loudly so that I didn't slip into like Mumbletown. Maybe I'll just try to not be so loud. Okay. Chapter 1. A long-expected party. When Mr. Bilbo Baggins of Bag End announced that he would shortly be celebrating his 11st birthday with a party of special magnificence, there was much talk and excitement in Hobbiton. Bilbo was very rich and very peculiar, and had been the wanderer of the Shire for 60 years, ever since his remarkable disappearance and unexpected return. The riches he had brought back from his travels had now become a local legend, and it was popularly believed, whatever the old folk might say, that the hill at Bag End was full of tunnels stuffed with treasure. And if that was not enough for fame, there was also his prolonged vigor to marvel at. Time wore on, but it seemed to have little effect on Mr. Baggins. At 90 he was much the same as at 50. At 99 they began to call him well preserved, but unchanged would have been nearer the mark. Yeah, it's because I'm being a little more quiet. There were some that shook their heads and thought this was too much of a good thing. It seemed rather unfair that anyone should possess, apparently, perpetual youth as well as, reputably, inexhaustible wealth. It will have to be paid for, they said. It isn't natural, and trouble will come of it. But so far trouble had not come, and as Mr. Baggins was generous with his money, most people were willing to forgive him his oddities and his good fortune. He remained on visiting terms with his relatives, except, of course, the Sackville Bagginses, and he had many devoted admirers among the hobbits of poor and unimportant families. But he had no close friends until some of his younger cousins began to grow up. The eldest of these, and Bilbo's favorite, was young Frodo Baggins. When Bilbo was 99, he adopted Frodo as his heir, and brought him to live at Bag End, and the hopes of the Sackville Bagginses were finally dashed. Bilbo and Frodo happened to have the same birthday, September 22nd. "You had better come and live here, Frodo, my lad," said Bilbo one day, "and then we can celebrate our birthday parties comfortably together." At that time, Frodo was still in his tweens, as the hobbits called the irresponsible 20s between childhood and coming of age at 33. 12 more years passed. Each year the Bagginses had given very lively combined birthday parties at Bag End, but now it was understood that something quite exceptional was being planned for that autumn. Bilbo was going to be 11-1, 111, a rather curious number, and a very respectable age for a hobbit. The old Took himself had only reached 130. And Frodo was going to be 33, 33, an important number. The date of his coming of age. Tongues began to wag in Hobbiton and Bywater, and rumor of the coming event traveled all over the Shire. The history and character of Mr. Bilbo Baggins became once again the chief topic of conversation, and the older folk suddenly found their reminiscences in welcome demand. No one had a more attentive audience than old Ham Gamgee, commonly known as the Gaffer. He held forth at the Ivy Bush, a small inn on the Bywater Road, and he spoke with some authority, for he had tended the garden at Bag End for 40 years, and had helped old Holman in the same job before that. Now that he was himself growing old and stiff in the joints, the job was mainly carried out by his youngest son, Sam Gamgee. Both father and son were on very friendly terms with Bilbo and Frodo. They lived on the hill itself, in number 3 Bagshot Row, just below Bag End. A very nice, well-spoken, gentle hobbit is Mr. Bilbo, as I have always said, the gaffer declared. With perfect truth, for Bilbo was very polite to him, calling him Master Hamfast, and consulting him constantly on the growing of vegetables, in the matter of roots, especially potatoes. The gaffer was recognized as the leading authority by all in the neighborhood, including himself. "But what about this Frodo that lives with him?" asked old Noakes of Bywater. "Baggins is his name, but he's more than half a brandy-buck, they say. It beats me why any Baggins of Hobbiton should go looking for a wife away there in Brandy-Buckland, where folks are so queer." "And no wonder they're queer," put in Daddy Two-Foot. I don't know why that's the one that got to me, but did. "And no wonder they're queer," put in Daddy Two-Foot, the gaffer's next door neighbor. Oh, I must steal that name. If they live on the wrong side of the Brandywine River, and right again, the Old Forest, that's a dark, bad place, if half the tales be true. "You're right, Dad," said the gaffer. "Not that the Brandybooks of Buckland live in the Old Forest, but they're a queer breed, seemingly. They fool about with boats on that big river, and that isn't natural. Small wonder that trouble come of it, I say. But be that as it may, Mr. Frodo is a nice young hobbit, as you would wish to meet, very much like Mr. Bilbo, and in more than looks. After all, his father was a Baggins. A decent, respectable hobbit was old Mr. Drogo Baggins. There was never much to tell of him, till he was drowned." "Drowned?" said several voices. They had heard this and other darker rumors before, of course, but hobbits have a passion for family history, and they were ready to hear it again. "Well, so they say," said the gaffer. "You see, Mr. Drogo, he married poor Miss Primula Brandybuck. She was our Mr. Bilbo's first cousin on the mother's side, her mother being the youngest of the old Took's daughters, and Mr. Drogo was his second cousin, so Mr. Frodo is his first and second cousin, once removed either way, as the saying is, if you follow me. And Mr. Drogo was staying at Brandy Hall with his father-in-law, old Master Gorbodoc, as he often did after his marriage, him being partial to his victuals, and the old Gorbodoc keeping a mighty generous table. And he went out boating on the Brandywine River, and he and his wife were drowned, and poor Mr. Frodo only a child and all. I've heard they went on the water after dinner, in the moonlight, said old Noakes, and it was Drogo's weight as sunk the boat. And I heard she pushed him in, and he pulled her in after him, said Sandyman, the Hobbiton miller. You shouldn't listen to all you hear, Sandyman, said the gaffer, who did not much like the miller. There isn't no call to go talking of pushin' and pullin'. Boats are quite tricky enough for those that sit still without looking further for the cause of trouble, anyway. There was this Mr. Frodo, left an orphan and stranded, as you might say, among those queer Bucklanders, being brought up, anyhow, in Brandy Hall. A regular warren, by all accounts. Old Master Gorboduc never had fewer than a couple of 100 relations at the place. Mr. Bilbo never did a kinder deed than when he brought the lad back to live among decent folk. But I reckon it was a nasty knot for those Sackville Bagginses. They thought they were going to get Bag End at the time when he went off and was thought to be dead. And then he comes back and orders them off. And he goes on livin' and never looking a day older, bless him. And suddenly he produces an heir, and has all the papers made out proper. The Sackville Bagginses won't never see the inside of Bag End now, or it is to be hoped not. There's a tidy bit of money tucked away up there, I hear tell, said a stranger, a visitor on business from Mitchell Delving in the West Farthing. All the top of your hill is full of tunnels packed with chests of gold and silver and jewels, spelled, by the way, Jools. Jewels, by what I've heard. Then you've heard more than I can speak to, answered the gaffer. I know nothing about jewels, Jools. Mr. Bilbo is free with his money, and there seems no lack of it, but I know of no tunnel making. I saw Mr. Bilbo when he came back, a matter of 60 years ago, when I was a lad. I had not long come pretence to old Holman. I actually don't understand that sentence. Him being my dad's cousin, but he had me up at Bag End, helping him to keep folks from trampling and traipsing all over the garden while the sale was on. And in the middle of it all, Mr. Bilbo comes up the hill with a pony and some mighty big bags and a couple of chests. I don't doubt they were mostly full of treasure he had picked up in foreign parts, where there be mountains of gold, they say, but there wasn't enough to fill tunnels. But my lad Sam will know more about that. He's an in and out of Bag End. Crazy about stories of the old days he is, and he listens to all Mr. Bilbo's tales. Mr. Bilbo has learned him his letters, meaning no harm, mark you, and I hope no harm will come of it. Elves and dragons, I says to him, cabbages and potatoes are better for me and you. Don't go getting mixed up in the business of your betters, or you'll land in trouble too big for you, I says to him, and I might say it to others, he added with a look at the stranger and the miller. But the gaffer did not convince his audience. The legend of Bilbo's wealth was now too firmly fixed in the minds of the younger generation of hobbits. Ah, but he has likely enough been adding to what he brought at first, argued the miller, voicing common opinion. He's often away from home, and look at the outlandish folk that visit him, dwarves coming at night, and that old wandering conjurer Gandalf and all. You can say what you like, gaffer, but Bag End's a queer place, and its folk are queerer. And you can say what you like about what you know no more than you do of boating, Mr. Sandyman, retorted the gaffer, disliking the miller even more than usual. If that's being queer, then we could do with a bit more queerness in these parts. There's some not far away that wouldn't offer a pint of beer to a friend if they lived in a hole with golden walls, but they do things proper at Bag End. Our Sam says that everyone's going to be invited to the party, and there's going to be presents, mark you, presents for all, this very month as is. That very month was September, and as fine as you can ask. A day or two later, a rumor, probably started by the knowledgeable Sam, was spread about that there were going to be fireworks. Fireworks, what is more, such as had not been seen in the Shire for nigh on a century, not indeed since old Took died. Days passed, and the day drew nearer. An odd-looking wagon, laden with odd-looking packages, rolled into Hobbiton one evening, and toiled up the hill to Bag End, the startled hobbits peering out of lamp-lit doors to gape at it. It was driven by outlandish folk, singing strange songs, dwarves with long beards and deep hoods. A few of them remained at Bag End. At the end of the second week in September, a cart came in through Bywater from the direction of Brandywine Bridge in broad daylight. An old man was driving it all alone. He wore a tall, pointed blue hat, a long gray cloak, and a silver scarf. He had a long white beard and bushy eyebrows that stuck out beyond the brim of his hat. Small hobbit children ran after the cart all through Hobbiton and right up the hill. It had a cargo of fireworks, as they rightly guessed. At Bilbo's front door, the old man began to unload. There were great bundles of fireworks of all sorts and shapes, each labeled with a great red G, and the elf rune, also G. That was Gandalf's mark, of course, and the old man was Gandalf the wizard, whose fame in the Shire was due mainly to his skill with fires, smokes, and lights. His real business was far more difficult and dangerous, but the Shire folk knew nothing about it. To them, he was just one of the attractions at the party. Hence the excitement of the hobbit children. "Gee for grand!" they shouted, and the old man smiled. They knew him by sight, though he only appeared in Hobbiton occasionally, and they never stopped long. But neither they nor any but the oldest of their elders had seen one of his fireworks displays. They now belonged to a legendary past. When the old man helped buy Bilbo and some dwarves, and finished unloading, Bilbo gave a few pennies away, but not a single squib or cracker was forthcoming, to the disappointment of the onlookers. "Run away now," said Gandalf. "You will get plenty when the time comes." Then he disappeared inside with Bilbo, and the door was shut. The young hobbits stared at the door in vain for a while, and then made off, feeling that the day of the party would never come. Inside Bag End, Bilbo and Frodo were sitting at the open window of a small room looking out west onto the garden. The late afternoon was bright and peaceful. The flowers glowed red and golden, snapdragons and sunflowers and nasturtiums trailing all over the turf walls and peeping out at the round windows. "How bright your garden looks," said Gandalf. "Yes," said Bilbo, "I am very fond of it indeed, and of all the dear old Shire, but I think I need a holiday." "You mean to go on with your plan, then?" "I do. I made up my mind months ago, and I haven't changed it." "Very well. It is no good saying any more. Stick to your plan, your whole plan, mind, and I hope it will turn out for the best, for you and for all of us." "I hope so. Anyway, I mean to enjoy myself on Thursday and have my little joke." "Who will laugh, I wonder?" said Gandalf, shaking his head. "We shall see," said Bilbo. The next day more carts rolled up the hill, and still more carts. There might have been some grumbling about dealing locally, but that very week orders began to pour out of Bag End for every kind of provision, commodity, or luxury that could be obtained in Hobbiton or Bywater or anywhere in the neighborhood. People became enthusiastic, and they began to tick off the days on the calendar, and they watched eagerly for the postman, hoping for invitations. Before long, the invitations began pouring out, and the Hobbiton post office was blocked, and the Bywater post office was snowed under, and voluntary assistant postmen were called for. There was a constant stream of them going up the hill, carrying hundreds of polite variations on, "Thank you, I shall certainly come." A notice appeared on the gate at Bag End. "No admittance except on party business." Even those who had, or pretended to have, party business were seldom allowed inside. Bilbo was busy writing invitations, taking off answers, packing up presents, and making some private preparations of his own. From the time of Gandalf's arrival, he remained hidden from view. One morning, the hobbits woke to find the large field south of Bilbo's front door covered with ropes and poles for tents and pavilions. A special entrance was cut into the bank leading up to the road, and wide steps and a large white gate were built there. The 3 hobbit families of Bagshot Row adjoined the field, were intensely interested, and generally envied. Old Gaffer Gamgee stopped even pretending to work on his garden. The tents began to go up. There was a specially large pavilion, so big that the tree that grew in the field was right inside it, and stood proudly near one end, at the head of the chief table. Lanterns were hung on all its branches. More promising still, to the hobbit's mind, an enormous open-air kitchen was erected in the north corner of the field. A draft of cooks from every inn and eating house for miles around arrived to supplement the dwarves and other odd folk that were quartered at Bag End. Excitement rose to its height. Then the weather clouded over. That was on Wednesday, the eve of the party. Anxiety was intense. On Thursday, September 22nd, actually dawned. The sun got up, the clouds vanished, flags were unfurled, and the fun began. Bilbo Baggins called it a party, but it was really a variety of entertainments rolled into one. Practically everybody living near was invited. A very few were overlooked by accident, but as they turned up all the same, that did not matter. Many people from other parts of the Shire were also asked, and there were even a few from outside the borders. Bilbo met the guests and additions at the new White Gate in person. He gave away presents to all and sundry. The latter were those who went out again by the back way and came in again by the gate. Hobbits give presents to other people on their own birthdays. Not very expensive ones, as a rule, and not so lavishly as on this occasion. But it was not a bad system. Actually, in Hobbiton and Bywater, every day in the year was somebody's birthday, so that every hobbit in those parts had a fair chance at least one present, at least once a week, but they never got tired of them. On this occasion, the presents were unusually good. The hobbit children were so excited that for a while they almost forgot about eating. There were toys the like of which they had never seen before, all beautiful, and some obviously magical. Many of them had indeed been ordered a year before, and had come all the way from the mountain and from Dale, and were of real dwarf make. When every guest had been welcomed and was finally inside the gate, there were songs, dances, music, games, and of course, food and drink. There were 3 official meals: lunch, tea, and dinner, or supper. But lunch and tea were marked chiefly by the fact that at those times all the guests were sitting down and eating together. At the other times there were merely lots of people eating and drinking, continuously from elevensies until 6:30, when the fireworks started. The fireworks were by Gandalf. They were not only brought by him, but designed and made by him, and the special effects, set pieces, and flights of rockets were let off by him. But there was also a generous distribution of squibs, crackers, bacca wrappers, sparklers, torches, dwarf candles, elf fountains, goblin barkers, and thunderclaps. They were all superb. The art of Gandalf improved with age. There were rockets like a flight of scintillating birds singing with sweet voices. There were green trees with trunks of dark smoke, their leaves opened like a whole spring unfolding in a moment, and their shining branches dropped glowing flowers down upon the astonished hobbits, disappearing with a sweet scent just before they touched their upturned faces. There were fountains of butterflies that flew glittering into the trees. There were pillars of colored fires that rose and turned into eagles, or sailing ships, or phalanx of flying swans. There was a red thunderstorm and a shower of yellow rain. There was... I missed the word. A forest of silver spears that sprang suddenly into the air with a yell like an embattled army, and came down again into the water with a hiss like 100 hot snakes. There was also one last surprise, in honor of Bilbo, and it startled the hobbits exceedingly, as Gandalf intended. The lights went out, a great smoke went up. It shaped itself like a mountain seen in the distance, and began to glow at the summit. It spouted green and scarlet flames. Out flew a red golden dragon, not life-size, but terribly lifelike. A fire came from his jaws, his eyes glared down. There was a roar, and he whizzed 3 times over the heads of the crowd. They all ducked, and many fell flat on their faces. The dragon passed like an express train, turned a somersault, and burst over Bywater with a deafening explosion. "That is the signal for supper," said Bilbo. The pain and alarm vanished at once, and the prostrate hobbits leaped to their feet. There was a splendid supper for everyone, that is, except those invited to the special family dinner party. This was held in the great pavilion with the tree. The invitations were limited to 12 dozen, a number also called by the hobbits 1 gross, though the word was not considered proper to use of people. And the guests were selected from all the families to which Bilbo and Frodo were related, with the addition of a few special unrelated friends, such as Gandalf. Many young hobbits were included, and present by parental permission, for hobbits are easygoing with their children in the matter of sitting up late, especially when there was a chance of getting them a free meal. Bringing up young hobbits took a lot of provender. There were many Bagginses and Boffins. There were also many Tooks and Brandybucks. There were a few various Grubbs, relations of Bilbo Baggins' grandmother, and various Chubbs, connections of his Took grandfather, and a section of Burrowses, Bolgers, Brace Grintles, Brockhouses, Goodbodies, Hornblowers, and Proudfoots. Some of these were only very distantly connected with Bilbo, and some had hardly ever been in Hobbiton before, as they lived in remote corners of the Shire. The Sackville Bagginses were not forgotten. Otho and his wife Lobelia were present. They disliked Bilbo and detested Frodo, but so magnificent was the invitation card written in gold ink that they had felt it was impossible to refuse. Besides, their cousin, Bilbo, had been specializing in food for many years, and his table held a high reputation. All the 144 guests expected a pleasant feast, though they rather dreaded the after-dinner speech of their host, an inevitable item. He was liable to drag in bits of what he called poetry, and sometimes, after a glass or two, would allude to the absurd adventures of his mysterious journey. The guests were not disappointed. They had a very pleasant feast. In fact, an engrossing entertainment, rich, abundant, varied, and prolonged. The purchase of provisions fell almost to nothing throughout the district in the ensuing week, but as Bilbo's catering had depleted the stocks of most of the stores, cellars, and warehouses for miles around, that did not matter much. After the feast, more or less, came the speech. Most of the company were, however, now in a tolerant mood, at that delightful stage which they called filling up the corners. They were sipping their favorite drinks, nibbling at their favorite dainties, and their fears were forgotten. They were prepared to listen to anything, and to cheer at every full stop. "My dear people," began Bilbo, rising to his place. "Hear, hear, hear," they shouted, and kept on repeating it in chorus, seemingly reluctant to allow their own advice. Bilbo left his place and went and stood on a chair under the illuminated tree. The light of the lanterns fell on his beaming face. The golden buttons shone on his embroidered silk waistcoat. They could all see him standing, waving one hand in the air. The other was in his trouser pocket. "My dear Bagginses and Boffins," he began again, "and my dear Tooks and Brandybooks and Grubbs and Chubbs and Burrowses and Hornblowers and Bolgers, Brace Griddles, Good Bodies, Brockhouses, and Proudfoots." "Proud feet!" shouted an elderly hobbit from the back of the pavilion. His name, of course, was Proudfoot, and well merited. His feet were large, exceptionally furry, and both were on the table. "Proudfoots," repeated Bilbo. "Also, my good Sackville Bagginses, that I welcome back at last to Bag End. Today is my 111th birthday. I am 11-1 today. Hooray, hooray, many happy returns," they all shouted, and they hammered joyously on the tables. Bilbo was doing splendidly. This was the sort of stuff they liked, short and obvious. "I hope you're all enjoying yourselves as much as I am." Deafening cheers, cries of yes and no, noises of trumpets and horns, pipes and flutes and other musical instruments. There were, as had been said, many young hobbits present. Hundreds of musical crackers had been pulled. Most of them bore the mark Dale on them, which did not convey much to most of the hobbits, but they all agreed they were marvelous crackers. They contained instruments, small, but of perfect make and enchanting tones. Indeed, in one corner, some of the young Tooks and Brandybucks, supposing Uncle Bilbo to have finished, since he had plainly said all that was necessary, now got up an impromptu orchestra, and began a merry dance tune. Master Everard Took and Miss Melliot Brandybuck got on a table, and with bells in their hands began to dance the Springle Ring, a pretty dance, but a rather vigorous. But Bilbo had not finished. Seizing a horn from a youngster nearby, he blew 3 loud hoots. The noise subsided. "I shall not keep you long," he cried. Cheers from all in the assembly. "I have called you all together for a purpose." Something in the way that he said this made an impression. There was almost silence, and 1 or 2 of the Tooks pricked up their ears. "Indeed, for 3 purposes. First of all, to tell you that I am immensely fond of you all, and that 11-1 years is too short a time to live among such excellent and admirable hobbits." Tremendous outburst of approval. "I don't know half as well as I should like, and I like less than half of you half as well as you deserve." This was unexpected and rather difficult. There was some scattered clapping, but most of them were trying to work it out and see if it came up to a compliment. "Secondly, to celebrate my birthday." Cheers again. "I should say our birthday, for it is, of course, also the birthday of my heir and nephew Frodo. He comes of age and into his inheritance today." Some perfunctory clapping by the elders, and some loud shouts of "Frodo, Frodo, jolly old Frodo" from the juniors. The Sackville Bagginses scowled and wondered what was meant by coming into his inheritance. "Together we score 144. Your numbers were chosen to fit this remarkable total, one gross, if I may use the expression." No cheers. This was ridiculous. Many of the guests, and especially the Sackville Bagginses, were insulted, feeling sure that they had only been asked to fill up the required number, like goods in a package. One gross indeed, vulgar expression. It is also, if I may be allowed to refer to ancient history, the anniversary of my arrival by barrel at Esgaroth on the Long Lake, though the fact that it was my birthday slipped my memory on that occasion. I was only 51 then, and birthdays did not seem so important. The banquet was very splendid, however, though I had a bad cold at the time, I remember. I can only say, "Thank you very much." I now repeat it more correctly. "Thank you very much for coming to my little party." Obstinate silence. They all feared that a song or some poetry was now imminent, and they were getting bored. Why couldn't he stop talking and let them drink his health? But Bilbo did not sing or recite. He paused for a moment. "Thirdly and finally," he said, "I wish to make an announcement." He spoke this last word so loudly and suddenly that everyone sat up who still could. "I regret to announce, though, as I said, 11 years is far too short a time to spend among you, that this is the end. I am going. I am leaving now. Goodbye." He stepped down and vanished. There was a blinding flash of light, and the guests all blinked. When they opened their eyes, Bilbo was nowhere to be seen. 144 flabbergasted hobbits sat back speechless. Old Odo Proudfoot removed his feet from the table and stamped. There had been a dead silence until suddenly, after several deep breaths, every Baggins, Boffin, Took, Brandybuck, Grub, Chub, Burrows, Bolger, Bracegirdle, Brockhouse, Goodbody, Hornblower, and Proudfoot began to talk at once. It was generally agreed that the joke was in very bad taste, and more food and drink were needed to cure the guests of shock and annoyance. "He's mad, I always said so," was probably the most popular comment. Even the Tooks, with very few exceptions, thought Bilbo's behavior was absurd. For the moment, most of them took it for granted that his disappearance was nothing more than a ridiculous prank. But old Rory Branderbuck was not sure. Neither age nor an enormous dinner had clouded his wits, and he said to his daughter-in-law, Esmeralda, "There's something fishy about this, my dear. I believe that Mad Baggins is off again, silly old fool. But why worry? He hasn't taken the victuals with him," he said loudly to Frodo to send the wine round again. Frodo was the only one present who had said nothing. For some time he had sat silent beside Bilbo's empty chair, and ignored all remarks and questions. He had enjoyed the joke, of course, even though he had been in the know. He had difficulty in keeping from laughter at the indignant surprise of the guests, but at the time he felt deeply troubled. He realized suddenly that he loved the old hobbit dearly. Most of the guests went on eating and drinking and discussing Bilbo Baggins's oddities, past and present, but the Sackville Bagginses had already departed in wrath. Frodo did not want to have any more to do with the party. He gave orders for more wine to be served, then he got up and drained his own glass silently to the health of Bilbo, and slipped out of the pavilion. As for Bilbo Baggins, even while he was making his speech, he had been fingering the golden ring in his pocket, his magic ring that he had kept secret for so many years. As he stepped down, he slipped it on his finger, and he was never seen by any hobbit in Hobbiton again. He walked briskly back to his hole, and stood for a moment, listening with a smile to the din in the pavilion and the sounds of merrymaking in other parts of the field. Then he went in. He took off his party clothes, folded up and wrapped in tissue paper his embroidered silk waistcoat, and put it away. Then he put on quickly some old, untidy garments and fastened round his waist a worn leather belt. On it he hung a short sword and a battered black leather scabbard. From a locked drawer, smelling of mothballs, he took out an old cloak and hood. They had been locked up as if they were very precious, but they were so patched and weather-stained that their original color could hardly be guessed. It might have been dark green. They were rather too large for him. He then went into his study, and from a large strong box took out a bundle wrapped in old cloths, and a leather-bound manuscript, and also a large bulky envelope. The book and bundle he stuffed into the top of a heavy bag that was standing there, already nearly full. Into the envelope he slipped his golden ring and its fine chain, and then sealed it and addressed it to Frodo. At first he put it on the mantelpiece, but suddenly he removed it and stuck it in his pocket. At that moment the door opened, and Gandalf came quickly in. "Hello," said Bilbo. "I wondered if you would turn up." "I am glad to find you visible," replied the wizard, sitting down in a chair. "I wanted to catch you and have a few words. I suppose you feel that everything has gone off splendidly according to plan." "Yes, I do," said Bilbo, "though that flash was surprising. It quite startled me, let alone the others." "A little addition of your own, I suppose." "It was. You have wisely kept that ring secret all these years, and it seemed to me necessary to give your guests something else that would seem to explain your sudden vanishment, and would spoil my joke." "You're an interesting old busybody," laughed Bilbo, "but I expect you know best as usual." "I do, when I know anything, but I don't feel too sure about this whole affair. It has now come to the final point. You've had your joke, and alarmed or offended most of your relations, and given the whole Shire something to talk about for 9 days, or 99, more likely. Are you going any further?" "Yes, I am. I feel I need a holiday, a very long holiday, as I have told you before. Probably a permanent holiday. I don't expect I shall return. In fact, I don't mean to. And I have made all arrangements." "I am old, Gandalf. I don't look it, but I am beginning to feel it in my heart of hearts. Well preserved, indeed," he snorted. "Why, I feel all thin, sort of stretched, if you know what I mean. Like butter that's been scraped over too much bread. That can't be right. I need a change, or something." Gandalf looked curiously and closely at him. "No, it does not seem right," he said thoughtfully. "No, after all, I believe your plan is probably the best." "Well, I've made up my mind anyway. I want to see mountains again, Gandalf. Mountains. And then find somewhere I can rest. In peace and quiet, without a lot of relatives prying around, and a string of confounded visitors hanging on the bell. I might find somewhere I can finish my book. I have thought of a nice ending for it." And he lived happily ever after to the end of his days. Gandalf laughed. "I hope he will, but nobody will read the book, however it ends." "Oh, they may in years to come. Frodo has read some already, as far as it has gone." "You'll keep an eye on Frodo, won't you?" "Yes, I will. 2 eyes, as often as I can spare them." "He would come with me, of course, if I asked him. In fact, he offered to once, just before the party. But he does not really want to, yet. I want to see the wild country again before I die, and the misty mountains. But he's still in love with the Shire, with woods and fields and little rivers. He ought to be comfortable here. I'm leaving everything to him, of course, except a few oddments. I hope he will be happy when he gets used to being on his own. It's time he was his own master now." "Everything?" said Gandalf. "The ring as well? You agreed to that, you remember." Well, yes, I suppose so," stammered Bilbo. "Where is it?" "In an envelope, if you must know," said Bilbo impatiently. "There on the mantelpiece. Well, no, here it is in my pocket." He hesitated. "Isn't that odd now?" he said softly to himself. "Yes, after all, why not? Why shouldn't it stay there?" Gandalf looked again very hard at Bilbo, and there was a gleam in his eyes. "I think, Bilbo," he said quietly, "I should leave it behind. Don't you want to?" "Well, yes, and no. Now it comes to it. I don't like parting with it at all, I may say. I don't really see why I should. Why do you want me to?" he asked. and a curious change came over his voice. It was sharp with suspicion and annoyance. "You're always badgering me about my ring. You've never bothered me about the other things I got on my journey." "No, but I had to badger you," said Gandalf. "I wanted the truth. It was important. Magic rings are, well, magical. And they are rare and curious. I was professionally interested in your ring, you may say, and I still am. I should like to know where it is, if you go wandering again. And I think you have had it quite long enough. You won't need it any more, Bilbo, unless I am quite mistaken." Bilbo flushed, and there was an angry light in his eyes. His kindly face grew hard. "Why not?" he cried. "And what business of it is yours anyway, to know what I do with my own things?" "It is my own. I found it. It came to me." Yes, said Gandalf. "There's no need to get angry." "If I am, it is your fault," said Bilbo. "It is mine, I tell you, my own, my precious, yes, my precious." The wizard's face remained grave and attentive, and only a flicker in his deep eyes showed that he was startled and indeed alarmed. "It has been called that before," he said, "but not by you." "But I say it now, and why not? Even if Gollum said the same once, it's not his now, but mine, and I shall keep it, I say." Gandalf stood up. He spoke sternly. "You will be a fool if you do, Bilbo," he said. "You make that clear with every word you say. It has gone too far. It has got far too much hold on you. Let it go, and then you can go yourself and be free." "I'll do as I choose and I go as I please," said Bilbo obstinately. Now, my dear hobbit, all your long life we have been friends, and you owe me something. Come, do as you promised. Give it up." "Well, if you want my ring yourself, say so," cried Bilbo. "But you won't get it. I won't give my precious away, I tell you." His hands strayed to the hilt of his small sword. Gandalf's eyes flashed. "It will be my turn to get angry soon," he said. "If you say that again, I shall. Then you will see Gandalf the Grey uncloaked." He took a step towards the hobbit, and he seemed to grow tall and menacing. His shadow filled the little room. Bilbo backed away to the wall, breathing hard, his hand clutching in his pocket. They stood for a while facing one another, and the air of the room tingled. Gandalf's eyes remained bent on the hobbit. Slowly his hands relaxed, and he began to tremble. "I don't know what has come over you, Gandalf," he said. "You've never been like this before. What is it all about? It is mine, isn't it? I found it. And Gollum would have killed me if I hadn't kept it. I'm not a thief, whatever he said." "I have never called you one," Gandalf answered. "And I am not one either. I am not trying to rob you, but to help you. I wish you would trust me, as you used." He turned away, and the shadow passed. He seemed to dwindle again into an old gray man, bent and troubled. Bilbo drew his hand over his eyes. "I am sorry," he said, "but I felt so queer, and yet it would be a relief, in a way, to not be bothered with it any more. It has been so growing on my mind lately. Sometimes I have felt it was like an eye looking at me, and I'm always wanting to put it on and disappear, don't you know, or wondering if it is safe, and pulling it out to make sure. I tried locking it up, but I found I couldn't rest without it in my pocket. I don't know why, and I don't seem to be able to make up my mind." "Then trust mine," said Gandalf. "It is quite made up. Go away and leave it behind. Stop possessing it. Give it to Frodo, and I will look after him." Bilbo stood for a moment, tense and undecided. Presently he sighed. "All right," he said with an effort. "I will." Then he shrugged his shoulders and smiled rather ruefully. After all, that's what this party business was all about, really. To give away lots of birthday presents and somehow make it easier to give it away at the same time. It hasn't made it any easier in the end, but it would be a pity to waste all my preparations. It would quite spoil the joke. Indeed, it would take away the only point I ever saw in the affair. "Very well," said Bilbo. "It goes to Frodo, with all the rest." He drew a deep breath. "And now I really must be starting, or somebody else will catch me. I have said goodbye, and I couldn't bear to do it all over again." He picked up his bag and moved to the door. You have still got the ring in your pocket," said the wizard. "Well, so I have. And my will and the other documents too. You had better take it and deliver it for me. That will be safest." "No, don't give the ring to me," said Gandalf. "Put it on the mantelpiece. It will be safe enough there till Frodo comes. I shall wait for him." Bilbo took out the envelope, but just as he was about to set it by the clock, his hand jerked back and the packet fell on the floor. Before he could pick it up, the wizard stooped and seized it and set it in its place. A spasm of anger passed swiftly over the hobbit's face again. Suddenly it gave way to a look of relief and a laugh. "Oh, that's that. Now I'm off." They went out into the hall. Bilbo chose his favorite stick from the stand, and then he whistled. 3 dwarves came out of different rooms where they had been busy. "Is everything ready?" asked Bilbo. "Everything packed and labeled?" "Everything," they answered. "Well, let's start then." He stepped out the front door. It was a fine night, and the black sky was dotted with stars. He looked up, sniffing the air. What fun. What fun to be off again on the road with dwarfs. This is what I've really been longing for years. "Goodbye," he said, looking at his old home and bowing to the door. "Goodbye, Gandalf." "Goodbye for the present, Bilbo. Take care of yourself. You are old enough, and perhaps wise enough." "Take care. I don't care. Don't you worry about me. I am as happy now as I have ever been, and that is saying a great deal. But the time has come. I am being swept off my feet at last," he added, and then in a low voice, as if to himself, he sang softly in the dark. "The road goes ever on, down from the door where it began. Now far ahead the road has gone, and I must follow if I can, pursuing it with eager feet until it joins some larger way, where many paths and errands meet, and whither then I cannot say." He paused, silent for a moment. Then, without another word, he turned away from the lights and voices in the fields and tents, and, followed by his 3 companions, went around into his garden and trotted down the long, sloping path. He jumped over a low place in the hedge at the bottom, and took to the meadows, passing into the night like a rustle of wind in the grass. Gandalf remained for a while, staring after him into the darkness. "Goodbye, my dear Bilbo, until our next meeting," he said softly, and went back indoors. Oh, we're almost there. I think we're going to make it in a good time. Frodo came in soon afterwards, and found him sitting in the dark, deep in thought. "Has he gone?" he asked. "Yes," said Gandalf. "He is gone at last." I hoped until this evening that it was only a joke," said Frodo. "But I knew in my heart that he really meant to go. He always used to joke about serious things. I wish I had come back sooner just to see him off." "I think, really, he preferred slipping off quietly in the end," said Gandalf. "Don't be too troubled. He'll be all right now. He left a package for you. There it is." Frodo took the envelope from the mantelpiece and glanced at it, but did not open it. "You'll find his will and all the other documents in there, I think," said the wizard. "You are the master of Bag End now. And also, I fancy you'll find a golden ring." "The ring!" exclaimed Frodo. "Has he left me that? I wonder why." "Still, it may be useful." "It may, and it may not," said Gandalf. "I should not make use of it, if I were you, but keep it secret, and keep it safe. Now I'm going to bed." Right? Yeah. Bilbo's the best. That is a feat for sure. As master of Bag End, Frodo felt it his painful duty to say goodbye to the guests. Rumors of strange events had by now spread all over the field, but Frodo would only say, "No doubt everything will be cleared up in the morning." About midnight, carriages came for the important folk. One by one they rolled away, filled with full but very unsatisfied hobbits. Gardeners came by arrangement, and removed in wheelbarrows those that had inadvertently remained behind. Night slowly passed. The sun rose. The hobbits rose rather later. Morning went on. People came and began, by orders, to clear away the pavilions, and the tables, and the chairs, and the spoons, and the knives, and the bottles and plates, and the lanterns, and the flowering shrubs in boxes, and the crumbs and cracker paper, the forgotten bags and gloves and handkerchiefs, and the uneaten food, a very small item. And then a number of other people came, without orders, Bagginses, and Boffins, and Bolgers, and Tooks, and other guests that lived or were staying near. By midday, when even the best fed were out and about again, there was a large crowd at Bag End, uninvited, but not unexpected. Frodo was waiting on the step, smiling, but looking rather tired and worried. He welcomed all the callers, but he had not much more to say to them than before. His reply to all inquiries was simply this: Mr. Bilbo Baggins has gone away, as far as I know, for good. Some of the visitors he invited to come inside, as Bilbo had left messages for them. Inside the hall there was piled a large assortment of packages and parcels and small articles of furniture. On every item there was a label tied. Some were several labels of this sort. For Adelard took, for his very own, from Bilbo, on an umbrella. Adelard had carried off many unlabeled ones. For Dora Baggins, in memory of a long correspondence, with love from Bilbo, on a large wastepaper basket. Dora was Drogo's sister, and the eldest surviving female relative of Bilbo and Frodo. She was 99, and had written reams of good advice for more than half a century. For Milo Burrows, hoping it will be useful, from B.B., on a gold pen and ink bottle. Milo never answered letters. For Angelica's use, from Uncle Bilbo, on a round, convex mirror. She was a young Baggins, and too obviously considered her face shapely. For the collection of Hugo Bracegirdle, from a contributor, on an empty bookcase. Hugo was a great borrower of books, and worse than usual at returning them. For Lobelia Sackville Baggins, as a present, on a case of silver spoons. Bilbo believed that she had acquired a good many of his spoons while he was away on his former journey. Lobelia knew quite well when she arrived later in the day. She took the point at once, but she also took the spoons. This is only a small selection of the assembled presents. Bilbo's residence had got rather cluttered up with things in the course of his long life. It was a tendency of hobbit holes to get cluttered up, for which the custom of giving away so many birthday presents was largely responsible. Not, of course, that the birthday presents were always new. There were one or two old mathams, of forgotten uses, that had circulated all around the district, but Bilbo had usually given new presents and kept those that he received. The old hole was now being cleared a little. Every one of the various parting gifts had labels written out personally by Bilbo, and several had some point or some joke, but of course most of the things were given where they would be wanted and welcomed. The poorer hobbits, especially those of Bagshot Row, did very well. Old Gaffer Gamgee got 2 sacks of potatoes, a new spade, a woolen waistcoat, and a bottle of ointment for creaking joints. Old Rory Brandybuck, in return for much hospitality, got a dozen bottles of Old Wynyards, a strong red wine from the South Farthing, and now quite mature, as it had been laid down by Bilbo's father. Rory quite forgave Bilbo, and voted him a capital fellow after the first bottle. There was plenty of everything left for Frodo, and of course, all the chief treasures, as well as the books, pictures, and more than enough furniture, were left in his possession. There was, however, no sign nor mention of money or jewelry. Not a penny piece or a glass bead was given away. Frodo had a very trying time that afternoon. A false rumor that the whole household was being distributed free spread like wildfire, and before long the place was packed with people who had no business there, but could not be kept out. Labels got torn off and mixed, Quarrels broke out. Some people tried to do swaps and deals in the hall, and others tried to make off with minor items not addressed to them, or with anything that seemed unwanted or unwatched. The road to the gate was blocked with barrows and hand carts. In the middle of the commotion, the Sackville Bagginses arrived. Oh boy. Frodo had retired for a while and left his friend Merry Brandybuck to keep an eye on things. When Otho loudly demanded to see Frodo, Merry bowed politely. "He is indisposed," he said. "He is resting." "Hiding, you mean?" said Lobelia. "Anyway, we want to see him, and we mean to see him. Just go and tell him so." Merry left them a long while in the hall, and they had time to discover their parting gift of spoons. It did not improve their tempers. Eventually, they were shown into the study. Frodo was sitting at a table with a lot of papers in front of him. He looked indisposed, to see Sackville Bagginses at any rate, and he stood up, fidgeting with something in his pocket, but he spoke quite politely. The Sackville Bagginses were rather offensive. They began by offering him bad bargain prices, as between friends, for various valuables and unlabeled things. When Frodo replied that only the things specially directed by Bilbo were being given away, they said the whole affair was very fishy. "Only one thing is clear to me," said Otho, "and that is that you are doing exceedingly well out of it. I insist on seeing the will." Otho would have been Bilbo's heir, but for the adoption of Frodo. He read the will carefully and snorted. It was, unfortunately, very clear and correct, according to the legal customs of hobbits, which demand, among other things, 7 signatures of witnesses in red ink. "Foiled again," he said to his wife. "And after waiting 60 years. Spoons? Fiddlesticks." He snapped his fingers under Frodo's nose and stumped off, but Lobelia was not so easily got rid of. A little later, Frodo came out of the study to see how things were going on, and found her still about the place, investigating nooks and corners and tapping the floors. He escorted her firmly off the premises, after he had relieved her of several small, but rather valuable, articles that had somehow fallen inside of her umbrella. Her face looked as if she was in the throes of thinking out a really crushing parting remark, but all she found to say, turning around on the step, was, "You'll live to regret it, young fellow. Why didn't you go too? You don't belong here. You're no Baggins. You're a Brandybuck." "Did you hear that, Merry? That was an insult, if you like," said Frodo when he shut the door on her. "It was a compliment," said Merry Brandybuck, "and so, of course, not true." They went round the hole and evicted 3 young hobbits, 2 boffins and a bolger, who were knocking holes in the walls of one of the cellars. Frodo also had a tussle with young Sancho Proudfoot, old Odo Proudfoot's grandson, who had begun an excavation in the large pantry, where he thought there was an echo. The legend of Bilbo's gold excited both curiosity and hope for legendary gold, mysteriously obtained, if not positively ill-gotten, is, as everyone knows, anyone's for the finding, unless the search is interrupted. I have got to explain to you guys, the sentence that I just read has a semicolon, a parenthetical, and an em dash, and like an extra clause that just has commas in it. Amazing. I understand where I got my writing style now. Oh boy. Anyway, when he had overcome Sancho and pushed him out, Frodo collapsed on a chair in the hall. "It's time to close this shop, Merry," he said. "Lock the door and don't open it to anyone today, not even if they bring a battering ram." He, battering ram. Then he went to revive himself with a belated cup of tea. He had hardly sat down when there came a soft knock at the front door. Lobelia again, most likely, he thought. She must have thought of something really nasty and had to come back again to say it. It can wait. He went on with his tea. The knock was repeated, much louder, but he took no notice. Suddenly, the wizard's head appeared at the window. "If you don't let me in, Frodo, I shall blow your door right down your hole and out through the hill," he said. "My dear Gandalf, half a minute!" cried Frodo, running out of the room to the door. Come in, I thought it was Lobelia." "Then I forgive you, but I saw her some time ago, driving a pony trap towards Bywater, with a face that would have curdled new milk." She had already nearly curdled me. Honestly, I nearly tried on Bilbo's ring. I longed to disappear. Don't do that, said Gandalf, sitting down. Do be careful of that ring, Frodo. In fact, it is partly about that I have come to say the last word. What about it now? Oh, that was wrong. Well, what about it? What do you know already? Only what Bilbo told me. I have heard his story, how he found it, how he used it, on his journey, I mean. Which story, I wonder, said Gandalf. Oh, not what he told the dwarves and put in his book, said Frodo. He told me the true story soon after I came to live here. He said you had pestered him until he told you. So I had better know too. No secrets between us, Frodo, he said. But they are not to go any further. It's mine anyway. That's interesting. Well, what did you think of it? If you mean inventing all that about a present, well, I thought the true story much more likely, and I couldn't see the point of altering it at all. It was very unlike Bilbo to do so anyway, and I thought it rather odd. So did I. But odd things may happen to people that have such treasures, if they use them. Let it be a warning to you to be very careful with it. It may have other powers than just making you vanish when you wish to. I don't understand, said Frodo. Neither do I, answered the wizard. I have merely begun to wonder about the ring, especially since last night. No need to worry, but if you take my advice, you will use it very seldom, or not at all. At least, I beg you not to use it in any way that will cause talk or rouse suspicion. I say again, keep it safe and keep it secret. You're very mysterious. What are you afraid of? I'm not certain, so I will say no more. I may be able to tell you something when I come back. I'm going off at once, so this is goodbye for the present. He got up. At once, cried Frodo. Why, I thought you were staying for at least a week. I was looking forward to your help. I did mean to, but I have had to change my mind. I may be away for a good while, but I'll come and see you again as soon as I can. Expect me when you see me. I shall slip in quietly. I shan't often be visiting the Shire openly again. I find that I've become rather unpopular. They say I'm a nuisance and a disturber of the peace. Some people are actually accusing me of spiriting Bilbo away, or worse, if you want to know. There is supposed to be a plot between you and me to get hold of his wealth. Some people, exclaimed Frodo. You mean Otho and Lobelia? How abominable. I would give them Bag End and everything else if I could get Bilbo back and go off tramping in the country with him. I love the Shire, but I begin to wish somehow that I had gone too. I wonder if I shall ever see him again. So do I, said Gandalf. And I wonder many other things. Goodbye now. Take care of yourself. Look out for me, especially at unlikely times. Goodbye. Frodo saw him to the door. He gave a final wave of his hand and walked off at a surprising pace, but Frodo thought the old wizard looked unusually bent, almost as if he was carrying a great weight. The evening was closing in, and his cloaked figure quickly vanished into the twilight. Frodo did not see him again for a long time. And that's it. That's the end of chapter 1. Page... I'll figure out. I got a bookmark. So yeah, that was book 1, chapter 1. I would like to keep going here. It kind of depends on how long YouTube allows the stream to continue. We'll see. We'll see how the YouTube gods treat the stream. But thank you guys for showing up. I hope it was a nice, chill end to the weekend. Yeah. I don't know. At this point, I'm thinking about turning in myself. I'm all sleepy now. I was planning on talking a little more about stuff and things, but I think we'll pick it up next Sunday. sometime between 8 and 9 Eastern Standard Time. I was aiming for 8, but I forgot how OBS worked, so had to teach myself that. And for anybody who has already fallen asleep, I will not tarry any longer nor try to keep you try to make you wake up. So have a good night, everybody, and good week. Happy holidays.